Thomas Fleming.
I want to thank John for the kind words, but also warn you that I told him I planned to talk for, 20, 25 minutes, and he said, oh, no, 55 at least. So if we're here at 2 o'clock, you know I'm not the one to blame. When I was thinking about coming, I've never been to this part of Michigan. I've only been through Michigan once or twice, although I was born in northern Wisconsin. And but I said, oh, I see there's a lot of interest in classical Greece around here, because I see bars called the Spartans, and well, this hotel, they're fond of the Spartans too. And it took a while, but I finally figured it out. I don't watch much television. I don't surf the internet for news because there isn't any, by and large. But a day or two ago, I was looking for a few things, and noticed one of the lead stories was a story in a California city where a park had turned up a lot of decapitated goats. And then simultaneously in Georgia, the Chattahoochee River, which gives Atlanta its water, they found 10 goat heads floating down the river. And oh, what could this possibly be? Well, a few evil-minded souls suggested Santeria, voodoo, and other diverse religions that are enriching our culture through immigration. And this is the sort of thing which I, way back in the dark ages growing up, could not have imagined. But now we live in a world where goat decapitation is a valid religious expression. Most of us, if we're lucky enough, live long, and we live long enough to complain about growing old. I certainly do. And as the years roll by, the world they live in begins to seem alien to them. The people they meet regard them as helpless idiots, completely out of the picture. People start calling you pops. The old guys, we're told, just don't get it. They don't understand this modern world with all these wonderful things happening. Nonetheless, as the years go by, some human beings do gain in wisdom. What they lose in the excitement factor. In a country that does not value learning or study of any kind, where the word research means looking up something on that great source of disinformation, Wikipedia, old age may constitute the best education anyone can get. This morning I'm going to share with you some of the fruits of my own experience, and so it's going to be more personal than talks I would normally give. I've been thinking and writing about immigration for 35 years. Growing up, I took it for granted that all sensible people wanted to defend the borders of their country. They realized that every nation, if it was a nation, had the right to decide what sort of people they would be letting in, because the sort of people you let into your country will determine the world your children live in. By the late 1970s, it began to be clear that the Democratic Party in general and its leaders like Ted Kennedy, but quickly joined by the Republicans, that they were trying to increase their power by changing our immigration policy, which means changing the nature of our country. The Hart-Celler Immigration Act radically altered the old formula, which had been based on the immigration patterns of previous generations, and they were privileging third world immigrants who would provide cheap labor for big business, and more important to the Kennedys and their followers, votes for the Democratic Party. It's automatic. This soon became a bipartisan policy that was characterized by the American novelist Edward Abbey in these terms. Conservatives got their cheap labor, liberals got their cheap cause. And this is the coalition that rules America. Those of us who have begun to think about the consequences of this policy imagined that the election of Ronald Reagan would make a difference. Well, it did. In the Reagan-Bush years, the Republican Party took a sharp turn to the left on the issues that my friend John O'Sullivan, who was the last decent editor of National Review, used to describe as the national question. That is, questions of immigration, trade, globalization. Free trade and open borders became the mantra of the Wall Street Journal. I remember my friend Peter Brimelow was once talking to the editor of the journal, Bob Barkley, who said, "Peter, the nation state is finished." He later lied and said he didn't say it, but that's the policy of the Wall Street Journal then and now. So, U.S. foreign policy experts in both parties began to implement Jimmy Carter's call to promote global democracy, which means, in essence, committing American troops, risking their lives, spending tons of money in order to draw third world countries into the American orbit. This nonsense culminated not so long ago in Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's demand that America promote revolution and even go to war to make sure Muslim women in the Middle East could dress the way they wanted. Now that's a cause worth dying for. Okay. Now interestingly, Ms. Clinton was perfectly happy to flood the country with wife-beating Muslim men she was familiar with because she was married to one. What conclusion could we draw from this except that the American political elite is willing to waste money and blood, that is our money and our blood, improving the lives of people everywhere in the world except here in the United States? I first started thinking seriously in political terms about immigration sometime back in the last ice age. Remember, before man-made global warming turned Michigan into a second Florida? And by the way, the Breakfast Bar has wonderful, locally grown, locally sourced oranges and other citrus products because the climate has so changed. Early in the first Reagan term, I went to Washington to talk to my friend from graduate school, Sam Francis. Sam and I had met there at Chapel Hill, and in D.C. we both had dinner with a senior aide to a North Carolina senator, and our friend, the aide, who was an aide to Jesse Helms, wanted to spend the evening talking about immigration. This was about 1981, 82. When I briefly changed the subject, the aide got up to leave, explaining that immigration was the most crucial factor facing Americans. I protested, surely, even if you're right, there are other issues facing our country that we can talk about. And the aide, in fact his name was Palmer Stacy, answered, of course there are, but if we don't quickly do something about immigration, we won't have a country. This was in the early 80s. A year or two after this conversation, I became editor of Chronicles magazine. I almost immediately began bringing up the question of immigration, an issue after issue. Wealthy donors and prominent Republicans complained that the GOP leadership knew what it was doing by promoting open borders. Not only did immigrants keep the price of labor low, even the price of, because illegal immigrants actually lower the wage price for legal immigrants. But these new Americans, who somehow understood America better than we did the minute they swam across the Rio Grande, they would serve as a counterweight to the solid block of Democratic voters provided by African Americans. All these Mexicans were going to become loyal followers of the GOP. I thought they were delusional, but to this day, very few of them have opened their eyes. Back in the 1980s and 90s, influential Republicans listened to the siren song of their party's leftist leaders, men like Bill Bennett, Jack Kemp, Newt Gingrich, and the Bushes. The leaders of the so-called conservative movement in Washington got so fed up with my treatment of immigration in Chronicles that they banded together to get me fired. And the pressure became acute when I published a special issue called A Nation of Immigrants. And all hell broke loose, literally. The New York neoconservatives waged a concerted attack day by day by day. I found myself denounced to the pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Commentary, but even National Review, a magazine I was writing for on a pretty regular basis, joined in the attack. What was interesting about the response of Bill Buckley and some, not all, of his editorial colleagues was the simple fact that Buckley had himself frequently warned against the danger of open immigration. What was still more odd, he had not even changed his mind. Well, so what was the attack all about? He was frightened. He was frightened by the New York neoconservatives. Now, the Crystals, the Benareses. This was a very confusing period to live through, as the conservative movement abandoned its commitment to protecting the nation and preserving our traditions. Many conservative writers were finding it difficult to understand why almost all the leaders of the conservative movement endorsed the policies of the Marxist left, in particular open borders. Now, I understood the motivation of the Washington think tanks. The Heritage Foundation, for example, was getting huge amounts of money from Japanese and Taiwanese businessmen. At the Goldwater retirement dinner, which I did not attend, but my several friends did, they said all the head tables were taken by Asian businessmen because they had paid for it, because they owned Heritage. And so when Heritage took positions refusing to help to preserve, for example, the American automobile industry from illegal trade practices by Asian manufacturers, Ed Fuller and Heritage just took the money. But why did National Review denounce people like Sam Francis, Joe Sobran, Pat Buchanan, Peter Brunello, and me? What was so important about this? The fog of my confusion began to lift when I was invited to speak at a major conference of immigration that was held in D.C. It was a mixed Democrat-Republican conference. It included conservative policy wonks at the immigration think tanks, FAIR and the others, as well as pragmatic liberals like Governor Dick Lamb of Colorado, who is a sort of friend of mine, Gaylord Nelson, former senator from Wisconsin, and also Peter Brunello, who eventually turned from a lucrative career at Forbes magazine to devoting himself to the immigration issue. I don't know if any of you look at VDare, his website on this. Yeah, it's a pretty useful source. Peter's a smart man. When you can understand a word he's saying, because his North of England accent is impenetrable even to his children. Yeah. I gave a talk on the cultural conflict at this, caused by immigration at this conference, and focusing on Latin American immigration. I made it clear that I admired many aspects of the cultures of Latin America. I'd been the chairman of a literary prize committee that gave large amounts of money and made a big deal out of writers, and I had been responsible for awarding prizes to Octavio Paz, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Jorge Borges. I have no prejudice against Latin culture. I've spent my life learning foreign languages and studying foreign cultures. And this study has taught me one highly important lesson, that great cultural traditions, the traditions of ancient Greece, Renaissance Italy, Elizabethan England, and our own early American Republic, these are not abstractions. They are the outgrowth of real people with historical traditions. It's not the Constitution that made this country great. Because if it were, then Liberia, which adopted the U.S. Constitution, would be just like us. It was the people who made the Constitution, not the Constitution that made the people. Of course, vigorous nations can and should take in a certain number of newcomers, because otherwise they get stagnant. But if they once allow themselves to be overrun, as the Roman Empire was overrun by some of our ancestors, German barbarians, their culture will be corrupted and destroyed. And within a couple of generations, you could look at people at exactly this point, in say the late 5th century A.D., but between that point and say 600 A.D., within 100 years, Roman civilization was more or less dead. That was the argument I was making then and now. That is, that people, whether you're French, American, Mexican, you have a right to maintain your cultural traditions. The response to my talk was shock and horror, especially from the conservatives who made their living as experts on immigration. In fact, liberals like Dick Lamb were willing to talk freely and even boldly about the problem. But I was informed, not by leftists, but by so-called opponents of open immigration, that I thought these people were my allies, that anyone who raised the cultural question was a bigot. A year or so later, I was at another panel, and Senator Alan Simpson was there, and one of the Republicans on the panel said that anyone who talked about the consequences of immigration was naturally a bigot. So I turned to Senator Simpson and I said, well, it's nice to know now that here in Washington, D.C., you're allowing a fellow Republican to stigmatize you as a bigot. He snorted like a bull elephant, and I had won an ally. Well, it wasn't this convenient. Anyone who goes to the root of the immigration question is by definition a bigot. Just as anyone who points out the shaky moral and legal foundations of affirmative action is a racist, anyone who argues for moral order is a fascist, And anyone who supports the free market is either an anarchist or a cold-blooded capitalist insensitive to human suffering. There was one guy, you may be familiar with David Frum. He used to attack me like once a week in the Wall Street Journal. Then he went on and he had this big article in National Review, Unpatriotic Conservatives, in which he did me the honor of putting me first. And so Frum would call me up on the phone, and he would interview me, and I would explain over and over how much I admired certain aspects of Latin American culture that were superior to our own. None of that ever made it into the Wall Street Journal. So, the future of American culture and the American nation is the heart of the immigration question, not the dollars and cents of it. And if the cultural question remains taboo, the doom of America is fixed, even if the means and the will could be found to seal the border and repatriate large numbers of illegal immigrants. There is no quick fix. Not even a wall, not even the most restrictive policies will save a people whose leaders are committed to national suicide. This reminds me, I was once in Paris, maybe a dozen years ago, and I was meeting with some French journalists, including a brilliant man named Jean Caux. He was one of the senior editors at Paris Match. He was a dramatist. He had been the secretary to Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous leftist philosopher. And Caux had become in favor of restrictive immigration. And he said, look, we once had the church, the army, and education in France that could turn immigrants into Frenchmen in one generation. Massive numbers of people from Poland, Spain, and Italy. He said, we don't have those institutions anymore. Those institutions have been destroyed, and therefore we have to restrict immigration. Well, how much more true is that here in America, where we have destroyed all our institutions? This is not the fault of the immigrants. This is our fault. We are committing suicide, and that part of the suicide pact is to open the border. To oppose mass immigration on strictly economic grounds is a strategy that ensures defeat. Economics is a blind science that cannot tell the difference between citizens and foreigners, friends and enemies. We're told, for example, the soundest criterion for a legal immigrant that we should admit is their educational level and potential earning. Well, it's a factor, but if 400 million hardworking and brilliant Chinese immigrants were admitted, our economy might boom, but our grandchildren would speak Chinese, not English. It would not be American. Chicano activists understand this reality, which is why they talk about the reconquest and the dream of rebuilding the Aztec world of Aztlan. Now this, of course, these are on the fringe. Professional critics of immigration policy who pretend this question does not exist are like cowards who hear burglars invading their home at night and just pull up the covers over their head. These economic pragmatists think they're playing practical politics by setting aside all questions of basic principle. Unfortunately, they are leaving the moral high ground to leftist idealists who take their stand on the high ground of lofty principles, international human rights, the brotherhood of man. This has two serious consequences. First, it means that young people and idealists, the perennial student types, they hear conservative arguments that rest on greed and indifference to human decency, and they're appalled. Marxists, like the Obamas and the Clintons, tell Americans it's their duty to help the world, but pragmatic Republicans say, well, that would be nice, and we wish we could do it, and they would open the border, but we just can't afford to do so. This is similar to the argument about the death penalty. Opponents of the death penalty say it's inhumane. Defenders say it just costs too much to keep murderers alive in prison. One side argues for dollars and cents, the other side argues for morality. That is why the death penalty is outlawed in 19 states, and it's a dead letter outside the South. The real argument here is about justice. What is justice? Not what costs more. This is one of several reasons why students are willing to listen to their silly, silly professors and are so regularly attracted to the left. I once debated affirmative action up in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. It was a hoot. Because I made, there are human differences. You have to take account of the faculty, who are all long-haired hippies in their 50s, were stomping their feet and yelling to shut me up. So I just turned to the students. I said, students, look at your mentors. These are the people that pose as the guardians of integrity and intelligence. Look at them and never believe a thing they say. They shut up. Okay. But unfortunately, these students stay on the left until they have to earn a living and pay taxes. But even then, when they have a family and some experience of the real world, they retain a warm and fuzzy feeling for leftist principles. They never shake it. They may end up voting Republican, but it's for Republicans like Marco Rubio, Susan Collins, God bless her today, and Jeff Flake. They think Sean Hannity and Mark Levin are true blue conservatives, you know, which I find one of the most amusing things. These talk show hosts are incredible. So the second consequence is that many people who think they are quite conservative are really simply confused. Their instincts may be right in most cases, but they cannot defend their positions because they don't know where to take a stand. This dilemma is not just over immigration, but over every left-right division. Conservatives inevitably defend their positions with left-wing language and left-wing principles. The welfare state is bad, not because it's inherently evil for third parties to steal a working man's money and buy votes from the unemployed. No, it's simply too costly, inefficient, and the welfare state makes slaves of welfare recipients. We're not permitted to sympathize with working taxpayers, only with the social predators that working taxpayers have to subsidize. Opponents of abortion almost never talk about the disgusting behavior of any mother who would even think about murdering her own child. This is not just some generic killing. This is not like some punk who goes to a liquor store and gets crazy and shoots them. This is a woman, a mother, killing her baby. And that's not the issue. The issue is some general right to life, like we shouldn't swat a mosquito. This immediately opens up the seamless garment argument that if abortion is wrong, so is capital punishment, so is war. Leftists are entirely right to take their stand on principle. Their only trouble is that their principles are almost entirely false. They're false politically, false morally, and false to the Christian religion. Sticking to immigration for the rest of my talk, the basic argument for open borders is a Marxist argument, though Marx himself borrowed it obviously from left-wing predecessors in the previous century. In a nutshell, Karl Marx argued that states and nations were created long ago at the dawn of history in a coup d'etat. This coup was staged by the same evil men who at the same time created private property, capitalism, and the family. Nation states are inherently illegal, evil, and illegitimate, and their only function in the modern world is to serve as laboratories for communist experiments in altering human nature. Once all the major nations of the world are communist, we won't have any borders and no government. But until that happens, rich nations have the duty to transfer wealth and opportunities to poor nations. Now, in Marx's day, travel was so difficult, immigration to Europe and North America from Africa and Asia was inconceivable. And so he was content just with this idea of north-south wealth transfer. But applied to the 20th century, Marx's analysis is the basis for all these arguments about open borders and political and economic globalism. Now, all these arguments go to a long-standing revolutionary tradition. We see it in the Russian Revolution, we see it in the French Revolution, we see it in the intellectual revolutions of the 16th, 17th, 18th century. This wasn't created by 60s hippies. This wasn't created even in the 20th century. It's very old. Now, at this point in any discussion, a Christian socialist or a Christian liberal will want to butt in and argue that nation states, national borders, and immigration restrictions are contrary to Christian teaching. If you've been to church lately, this is what you'll hear from the pulpit in 90% of American churches in just about every denomination. Fortunately, I go to a church where I don't have to hear that. I used to think these people were simply ignorant. But an ignorance that is so complete and so perfect cannot be entirely natural. They have to work hard at remaining stupid. Ignorance, says one of Oscar Wilde's funniest characters, ignorance is a rare exotic fruit. Touch it, and the bloom is gone. Well, you'd think after any experience of the world you couldn't believe this nonsense. So I've decided to treat these Marxists, these Christian Marxists, as morally responsible human beings and simply say they lie. They lie about everything from global warming to Head Start programs to Brett Kavanaugh. Viewing Christianity as the enemy, intellectuals have always felt justified in misrepresenting what Christianity actually teaches. Either they make them to make them contemptible, as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his neo-pagan followers today in the alt-right movement, that's what they do, or to pervert them to what they saw as good use. So-called Christian socialists, the social gospelers, they try to make it appear that true Christianity, as opposed to the bogus faith of the previous 2,000 years, true Christianity would dispense with all distinctions, including national boundaries. To delegitimate the right of nations to defend their territory, leftists will always quote Paul's statement in Galatians that in baptism there is neither Jew nor Greek, as if Paul's intent was not to stop the quarrels that were breaking out between Jewish and Gentile Christians, but to obliterate ethnic and cultural boundaries. This absurdity and dishonesty in such an interpretation is made clear by what Paul goes on to say. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Surely no candid reader would argue that Paul, who more than once tells slaves to obey their masters and tells runaway slaves to return home, Paul was no opponent of slavery. I mean, people who try to say that are even more absurd than the Christian socialists. And Paul, who has always been stigmatized in modern times as a woman hater, as a misogynist, he could hardly be accused of pursuing a feminist agenda. Some leftists have pretended that Christians cannot restrict immigration, even if they believe it is harmful to their nation's security and prosperity. And they cite such statements from the Old Testament as, "Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." But they conveniently ignore the dozens and dozens of passages in which aliens are condemned and despised throughout the Old Testament. A Jew could charge interest on money loaned to a stranger, but not to a Jew. Second Esdras, among the countless curses it pronounces against foreigners in Babylon and Egypt, includes the threats that those who labor will labor in vain, because, quote, strangers shall reap their fruits and spoil their goods, overthrow their houses, and take their children captive. So immigration is a curse. Like most ancient peoples, the children of Israel were intensely chauvinistic and xenophobic. By their own account that they give in the books of Joshua and Judges, they exterminated the Gentile population of Canaan when they entered the Promised Land. By the way, they didn't actually do it. And they were forever quarreling with their neighbors. More perilously for themselves, they were quarreling with the great kingdoms of the Middle East, and these were policies that led to their destruction. The passage of time and the experience of exile did nothing to soften Jewish chauvinism. In what might be understood as an outburst of xenophobia, the prophet Nehemiah tells us that Israelites returning from the Babylonian captivity separated themselves from non-Jews or from the Samaritans, made a covenant not to intermarry with them. Now, obviously, he's indulging in a little bit of wishful thinking, because when boys and girls get together, it's more than just a beer bash with young Brett Kavanaugh. That's my last Brett Kavanaugh reference, by the way. In light of these and other passages I could have cited, it's dishonest to pretend that the Jews' undoubted kindness to strangers who sojourned in their country constituted an argument against defensive war or immigration restriction. Now, there's a contradiction in the Old Testament approach, an apparent contradiction to foreigners. If we look, but we can resolve it if you look at the text. Now, okay, I have a terrible confession. By trade, I'm a philologist. I'm a student of language. I was a professor of Greek and Latin. So for me, words have meaning, and it's important to look at words. In the English Bible, we have all the English translations of the Bible, we refer to strangers or foreigners indifferently. In Hebrew, there were two words, and they're translated consistently into Greek and into Latin as two different terms. One is the sojourning stranger in your land who is he's a proselyte. He's in the process of becoming a Jew. In fact, the word proselyte means visitor in Greek. The other is a mere stranger. And so the proselytes were treated with kindness and courtesy because they were like resident aliens who were assimilating to Jewish culture. The others were insulted and abused. An alien could not so much as touch the bread being offered to God. And if a priest's daughter married a foreigner, she could not eat the holy food that the priests and their families partook of. A foreigner who approached the tabernacle was put to death. And no bread could be offered to their God from a foreigner's hand, quote, because corruption is in them. It's from Leviticus.
These are goys? Are these goys you're talking about?
Yeah. But, I mean, of course, most of these people were actually very closely related to Jews, but like the Moabites, the Edomites, etc. But yeah. So it's true that Judaism has in it this very, very fine and decent conception that people who want to come and live in our country and become like us should be treated humanely and decently. But if they're just passing through, just get rid of them as soon as possible and do not allow them to take part in any of the rituals of common life of the Jewish people. It's totally misrepresented by every preacher you're going to hear. Their first cousins, the Edomites, who were descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother, only gained full rights after 3 generations of living with the children of Israel as if they were Jews. Solomon the wise took a census of the strangers in Israel, and then he sent them off to do hard labor when he had their names and addresses. The writings of the New Testament, they repeat the earlier call to treat these proselytes decently, but they have nothing to say on the subject of territorial sovereignty or immigration. The writers of the New Testament assume the backdrop of the Roman Empire, whose rulers and armies are authorized to defend the Greco-Roman world. And, Paul's admonition in Romans 13, not in vain does the ruler hold the sword. I mean, the whole point is it's the sword to defend you in war and the sword to punish the criminal. When massive unauthorized immigration did take place from the 4th to the 6th centuries AD, the Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, the Burgundians destroyed the Roman Empire and put civilization on hold for several centuries. Now, there's a big difference, though, between what happened to the Romans and what's happening to us. They tried to stop it. They did not have the resources because they had taught the Germans how to farm and have food surpluses, and they had also taught them how to use Roman weapons and fight in the Roman style. And so the Germans had massive superiority of numbers combined with the ability to fight like Romans. Historically, Christian rulers and their subjects have had no reluctance to defend their commonwealths against pagans and heretics or against each other. And if they had no other piece of scripture, the story of the Tower of Babel would have told them that the Creator had established separate peoples and warned them against any attempt to corral all the nations of the world into one world government. You all know the story that men are building this tower, which is clearly the city of Babylon with its towering ziggurats. And the Creator looks down and says, who do they think they are? They're going to try to be gods. And so he causes them all to start speaking in foreign tongues. Put simply, globalism, the deduction to make, globalism was then and is now the political ideology of those who listen to the tempter's words in Genesis, you can become as gods. In Babylon, the project failed because of the multiplicity of languages and cultures. But of course, that must be, if you go to Detroit or any major industrial city in America, you're going to find the same problem of communication in the workforce. In America, everyone is told every day that cultural diversity is a blessing. They never explain why it's a blessing. We're just told it's a blessing. Anyone who's ever spent a lot of time in a culturally diverse place is aware of the problems. In my case, I spent a great deal of time in the former Yugoslavia during the period of the breakup. I was covering the war and the politics of the war, and I was lucky to know certain people. I had a guy who worked for me who was the brother-in-law of Slobodan Milosevic, and later on I became a good friend of the more pro-Western president, Voja Koštunica. Now, this was not a pretty thing to witness. Bosnian Muslims were spit roasting their Christian enemies at the beginning of the war, as they had done in World War II. Albanian Muslims were systematically murdering Christians, dynamiting church, digging up graveyards, wiping out all evidence that anyone but Albanian Muslims had ever lived in the Kosovo territory. Now, these were people who had been living together more or less for about 5 centuries. But of course, and let us not forget that the U.S. government encouraged, paid, and armed the Muslim terrorists. We've never waged a war on terrorism. Let's just drop that little nonsense. We have waged a war for terrorists. Chechen terrorists, Kosovo Albanian terrorists, Bosnian Muslim terrorists. Look across the world. Wherever there are Christians to be persecuted by Muslims, we're paying them. In Iraq, the Kurds are murdering and expelling Arab Christians and there's hardly a country in sub-Saharan Africa where ethnic conflicts do not result in mass murders, particularly of Christians. You can learn the same lesson in Los Angeles or Chicago, where criminal gangs are organized mainly along ethnic lines. In Los Angeles, black prison inmates have been begging to be separated from Mexican inmates because the Mexicans have been killing them. There's academic studies of conflict around the world show very clearly that ethnic conflict is the most serious form of political violence that anyone faces, and that usually religion is only like a badge of ethnic identity. So when it's Northern Irish Protestants versus Southern Irish Catholics, it's an ethnic conflict much more than it is a religious conflict. You know, in Iraq, Turkey, the Kurds are busy with U.S. protection, are slaughtering the Christians of northern Iraq, who have been there for 2,000 years. Tension, conflict, and mass murder are only the most obvious fruits of cultural diversity. If I had not decided to stick to the high road in this talk, I could bring up some of the peculiar traditions in some third world countries that are being imported into the United States. Some of these traditions involve women in marriage, like polygamy, keeping of concubines in the house, beating and murdering wives, female genital mutilation. Some others involve standards of cleanliness and sanitation. We have these quaint Western customs like washing our hands after using the bathroom, especially if we're working with food. Using designated plumbing facilities rather than eliminating our waste products into farm fields. Really, it's becoming important to know where your food was picked before, and to make sure it's washed, because there's so many outbreaks of foodborne diseases. One of the most significant contributions made by cultural diversity is the introduction of diseases, not just E. coli and salmonella, but killer strains of pneumonia brought in by Russian criminals. Tuberculosis and even black plague have re-entered the country. And if I wanted to drag you down into the gutter, which I'm not going to do, I might talk about the ultra-violent drug cartels that are terrorizing the American Southwest. The homicidal maniacs and gangs like the Salvadoran MS-13, which is really part of a large coalition of drug dealing gangs. And when they're all usually killing each other, but when they come to America and they're in prison, they end up siding completely against the American convicts. And when they're not engaged in drug dealing, they're practicing child prostitution, sexual slavery, rape, and murder. Recently, several of them beat to death someone they mistakenly belonged to a rival group. Now, most MS-13 members are young, but a 47-year-old Salvadoran illegal who had been deported multiple times was recently arrested for beating people to death with a baseball bat. It was sort of his hobby. In a deliberately deceptive article, the Washington Post reports Ramon Escobar was arrested in Houston several times, dating back to the mid-1990s. He spent 5 years for burglary, also been charged with assault and criminal trespass. And he was deported 5 times and always came back, and was in fact let out. And then he took up this new habit of beating people to death. Okay, well, I think I'm probably getting close to running out of time. Is that true? Yes. Well, not really. 15. 15, good. I'll be through more than that. Now, so cultural diversity does have have its downside, including, of course, the decapitated goats being found in parks all over the United States, which is, not, by the way, not after a nice it's not the result of a nice barbecue. I happen to like goat meat, barbecued goat meat, but these are religious cults. Well, why do we bother even trying to pretend we have a border or that we care about enforcing it? Why do we fund ICE? It's like I once spotted a burglar. I'd been informed by the police that a cat burglar was operating our neighborhood. Well, I found it. I got his make and model of his car. I got the license plate. I identified him. I said, why don't you turn yourself in? I called the police. Don't worry, we'll talk to you. No, they never came. Well, that's essentially how our immigration authorities, not in every detail, but essentially they are prevented, even if they want to, they're prevented from acting. So, it's these outrageous issues, the criminal behavior of our diverse immigrants is not really the issue. Even where two cultures are somewhat compatible, they do not tend to share their virtues and higher cultural accomplishments. Just consider this. I spend a lot of time in Italy every year. Occasionally, I'm taken to Italian restaurants in America. Neapolitan pizza, risotto Milanese are magnificent foods. But in America, they turn into fast food slop. The same thing is true of Mexican food. I've magnificent food in Mexico, which even in border towns like Juarez and these other towns that ring the border. But step over into El Paso or Del Rio, and all of a sudden you're eating garbage. The same can be said of Greek and Chinese cuisine. Chinese cuisine is one of the 3 or 4 great cuisines of the world, but just don't try to find it anywhere outside of maybe San Francisco. What is true of cuisines is true of culture generally. That is, you mixing them almost always results in deterioration. We need to be someone in particular with a specific language, culture, religion, cultural tradition before we can then venture out to appreciate other traditions. And speaking as somebody who had literally spent my life studying other cultural traditions and learning to value them, I cannot overemphasize this point. America's greatest poet of the 20th century, Robert Frost, put this beautifully in a poem. He said, "My friends all know I'm interpersonal, but long before I'm interpersonal, way down inside, I'm personal. Just so, before we're international, we're national and act as nationals. The colors are kept unmixed on the palette, or better, on dish plates around the room." Now, this is not possible today, and we have a lot of cultural intermixing, and a lot of it works well. I have 2 half-Asian grandchildren. I mean, I understand the difficulties and the advantages of how this could work. En masse, and we have many fine contributions from different immigrant groups, but there has to be limits. I often reflect on a conversation I had with my friend, the great British novelist Muriel Spark, when I visited her in Tuscany. Until her death, she was one of the 2 or 3 best fiction writers in the English language. Books like The Crime of Miss Jean Brodie, which they made into a movie. During the wars in Yugoslavia, she told me, she often thought back on the days when the British thought of Yugo, as they called it, as an inexpensive place for a holiday. Imagine, she said, all that time they were lying in the sun or eating cevapcici and drinking cheap wine. The smiling waiters and desk clerks were plotting genocide against each other. Now, many Serbs and Croats have told me it wasn't like that. But on the other hand, when I've talked to the same Serbs and Croats about each other, then they're sharpening the knives within the first 5 minutes. It's an uneasy thought. When we sit in ethnic restaurants and listen to the cheerful music, what is that music telling us? I like Mexican pop music. The Trio Los Panchos, I think, is more beautiful than just about any, and Mexican music of that type is more beautiful than 99% of our popular music. But there's an entire genre of music devoted to celebrating the exploits of narco-terrorists. One of my favorite songs in this genre is a little ditty El Gringo El Mexicano, excuse my very bad Spanish, I can only read it, sung by the great Norteño group, the Tigers of the North, Los Tigres del Norte. They come from Sinaloa. They're among the best-selling Mexican musicians on either side of the border, and their specialty is the narco corrida, the ballad that sings of the violent lives and deaths of drug lords and immigrant smugglers. In this song, Cipriano and his wife Rosa Maria cross the border as wetbacks and find work on a ranch near McAllen, Texas. The gringo boss takes a fancy to Rosa Maria and intimidates her into becoming his mistress. When Cipriano finds out, he kills the gringo first, and then, although his wife pleads that the gringo had threatened to turn her into immigration authorities, he kills his wife also. 20 years later in prison, he's crossing the bridge back into Mexico, where he meets his son, who embraces him and tells him he did the right thing. He would kill any woman who betrayed him. He's talking about his mother. The song takes several things for granted. First, if you need a job, just go to the other side of the river. The border is arbitrary. The members of Los Tigres, by the way, now live in San Jose, California. Second, the gringos who employ Mexicans always exploit them. Third, killing gringo exploiters and the women they exploit is not only justifiable but praiseworthy. Now, by the way, I've studied revenge cultures. I have a good deal of respect for the morality of revenge cultures across the world. I'm sort of an expert on revenge and dueling, but this is not part of the American tradition. We don't know how to handle this. The popularity of these songs, which are played all the time on the radio and even taught in California public schools, should give us pause. No one knows how many Mexican and Mexican Americans reside in the U.S. In the roundest of numbers, there are perhaps 15 million Mexican immigrants, a third of them illegal, and perhaps 15 million U.S. citizens of Mexican origin or descent, making a total of 30 million. There are at least 10 million more people from other parts of Latin America. As a percentage of the American population, Latinos have overtaken African Americans as the dominant minority group. And if current high rates of immigration are permitted to continue, the Latino proportion of the population figure would double in perhaps 10 years. Now, there are ups and downs in the trends, so it's hard to make predictions. Given the differential in birth rates between non-Latino and Latino Americans, the United States may be rapidly headed toward a situation resembling that of Canada, which is bilingual, bicultural, and binational. Except in Canada, the tension is between two European groups, British and French, and these groups have been interacting and influencing each other for 1,000 years. I mean, after all, English is about 50% derived from Norman French. In the worst case scenario, a binational America would be the scene of an armed struggle between not just two groups, but several groups. More optimistically, we might imagine a future United States in which Americans of Mexican descent have been peacefully assimilated as, say, Italians and Greeks and others. Although the trouble is, when you have this proximity, they can always go back, and the cultures constantly being reinfused. Which scenario will play out, I simply do not know. But this one thing I do know, that the problem does not lie with the immigrants, it lies with us, a nation that has lost its sense of identity. Since at least the 1960s, we have accepted leftist, anti-American, and anti-Western propaganda. We paid for Marxist feminist teachers who shoved it down the throats of our school children. Our historical and cultural roots were torn up and kept completely, and our children were kept ignorant of our true history. We have been taught to view ourselves as the descendants of oppressors, exploiters, and mass murderers. The names Travis, Bowie, and Houston are forgotten in the United States, and David Crockett is only remembered for an old TV Disney series. Even in Texas, right now, there is a campaign on to eliminate the word hero from textbooks describing the defenders of the Alamo. By the way, if you go to San Antonio, you'll find out that prominent in the Texas Revolution were Hispanic Texans who sided with the Americans because the Mexican government was so rotten. And it's like the ongoing attack on Confederate monuments, which people in the Midwest say, well, it's not my heroes. Well, believe me, when they get through with Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, they're coming for George Washington and everybody, because the point is that you people are the obstacle to progress, and you have to be eliminated. Not necessarily physically. There's something that the UN recognizes as cultural genocide. You deprive a people of its historical memory, its traditions, its culture. We've learned to hate our country, and we cannot stanch the hemorrhaging border for precisely the same reason that we insist on teaching our children to hate the people and habits that made this country. So the first step toward resolving the cultural problems presented by mass immigration is to quit pointing the finger at the immigrants and point the finger at ourselves. The second is to recognize the fact that immigrants will affect us as much as we affect them, maybe more. The third is to recognize that the larger part of this problem is our own devising. American mass culture, including the schools that pervade mass education, are breeding grounds for anti-American resentment and American self-hatred. To halt and reverse this problem, Americans must be willing to take several bold steps. I doubt they're going to do it. Quite apart from whatever is done to control legal and illegal immigration, we have to transform the teaching of the humanities in elementary and high schools and in the universities. Our schools do not value Western culture as something good or as our precious heritage. At best, it's the foundation of an open society that encourages toleration of opposing points of view. When your enemy don't believe in toleration, this is a policy of suicide. This is the best they can do because many textbooks and teachers present history as a morality play in which evil European men bully women, burn Indian villages, and lynch African Americans. That's American history. We need to revive the old understanding that the purpose of a nation's educational system is to form the character and historical imagination of the citizens. In our case, this would mean that European and American history would be taught from a Western and American point of view. Beginning in the lower grades, the classics of English and American literature would be required reading. And the ancient Greek and Latin classics, which along with the teaching of Latin were the foundation of our civilization for over 2,000 years, would be once again given their honored place. And above all, in your own personal lives. If you can't change all this, there's one thing you can do. You could turn this off. You could turn your computer off. You could quit looking at Fox News. You could turn off all the TV and begin to live like a human being instead of some robot being programmed by this massive media industry. If American citizens prove themselves incapable of taking control of their own lives and of their cultural future by controlling immigration and restoring the institutions of their culture, they will not so much be losing their country as simply acknowledging the fact that it's already been lost. There is no fate of, no law of historical necessity that says America has to lose its identity. Our future's up to us, but that's always been true. And so I put the ball into your court. Thank you very much. Regarding the cultural clue was that the Byzantines believed that they were not just heirs to the Roman Empire, but that they were Romans. They were Romei. And in fact, until the late 19th century, Greeks typically, they didn't call themselves Hellenes, they called themselves Romans because of this. And so Rome had an historical destiny to civilize the world. I mean, this goes back to the late Republic, and throughout the Roman Empire they believed it. Second of all, they had, even though they didn't like to talk about it explicitly, they had the unity of Greek language and culture. If you were a Slav or somebody from central Anatolia, you were an Isaurian, you came to Constantinople, you had to learn how to behave. You learned the manners of the capital, you learned the language, and you had the Orthodox religion. So that's the third, the religion. So they had religious unity, they had a sense of political destiny, they had cultural unity, and it worked. And I brought up this French intellectual, Jean Caux, who said, once upon a time, France had nothing that strong, but then France wasn't as diverse as the Byzantine Empire. And so I've argued, I'm very glad you asked this question, because I have been arguing over the years that since America doesn't have ethnic unity, that the best way is to learn lessons from the Byzantine experience. And you can't be running around tearing down monuments and denigrating your ancestors and your past, refusing to teach English properly as a language. In my lifetime, the standards of English have fallen from year to year in just American middle classes. I would hire college graduates and I didn't know what the heck they were talking about half the time, because everybody speaks, they speak Valley Girl, everything ends with a question mark. I'm constantly bewildered. So the Byzantines didn't allow that. So they had culture, language, and religion. Thank you.
Yeah, mostly I just wanted to say thank you for, I've rarely heard the symptoms of our problems put out so succinctly. It's really something that this country needs to hear. And I just wanted to urge everybody to go out and vote, to come out. If I do disagree with you at all, it's just I don't despair.
No.
Even if we can only delay our collapse, we should do that. And I urge everybody, the Republicans do not deserve our vote, but the Democrat Party has to be stopped. These are people who won't rest until every last American flag is burned, every child is raped, and every last dollar is squandered.
Yeah.
We have to stand up against these traitors, all right? So it's not that the Republicans, I don't even like the Republicans, all right, but they're not open traitors. So
They don't hate us.
they don't hate.
They collaborate, but they don't
They
hate
have
us.
tons of faults, and we could spend hours talking about their faults. So anyway, I think our battle is ultimately spiritual and metaphysical, but humanly speaking, and you alluded to this too, one of our big problems is public education. What do you advocate? How can we convince people? What's a good, effective way to take their kids out of public schools?
Well, okay, thank you. For one thing, yes, despair is very fruitless, and it makes life embittering. Maybe every great cause is always lost from the first moment, but sometimes it may take 300 years to lose it, and those are pretty good 300 years. You have children and grandchildren to carry about. When you get old enough, then that's all that you carry about. So if you could just keep the battle going for another generation, or you've done your part, and when you lay down the torch and pass it on, you've at least done your part. On the education thing, there are a couple of things which have to be done. And one is to break up the public school monopoly. Politically, in other words, this means getting rid of teacher certification, dissolving state boards of education, letting local school boards, as corrupt and stupid as they are, it's better to have the local school board, and by the way, very small districts, controlled by the families in them. So that now a lot of these families are dumb and they don't know what to do, but the fact is they care more about their children than I care about their children, or that the public school establishment cares. So you've got to re-empower parents and local communities. Now, it would be, if we could, with a stroke of the pen, get rid of the public school monopoly, that would be a great thing. Short of that, we can work on deconsolidation. The tendency since the late 19th century, unfortunately, up till the present, has been ever consolidating into bigger and bigger districts where the citizens in those districts, the parents, have less and less control. This is a whole different subject, and I'm happy on which I've written at length, but really re-empowering the people who are impacted by education, because even, I won't say the worst of parents, but many ignorant and parents, the one thing you could say about them is that they really do want, they may not know what's best for their kids, but they want it for them. And schools would improve immediately across the board, in every ethnic segment of the United States. One of the things that massive school desegregation did was it disenfranchised the black middle class. They had to leave their neighborhoods and move into white suburbs because they could no longer control the neighborhoods they lived in, where they were the leaders. So all of this stuff, which is a huge power grab, first at the level of the state capital and then at the level of the national capital, this is something that always vote against it, every single time.
Go ahead. Just a reminder, by the way, they did bring in more coffee, and there's still donuts, some very unhealthy donuts there for you to eat. They're very good, though.
If you don't eat them, we'll take them home and John will eat them also.
That's why I want you to get up. John. Go ahead.
One thing I noticed was a theme in your talk that I agree with, by the way, is how ultimately we are, as the people, responsible for the situation we find ourselves in. I think it was, what's his name, the Catholic guy, J.K. Chesterton, who said that people are ultimately going to get the government they deserve.
Yeah.
You know, and it's, he said something about, you know, they're going to get a president who's a legit idiot. Not that that's Trump, by the way. I think we already got that with Obama for all intents and purposes. But my question for you is, it is a little bit esoteric, okay? Is it really, you know, is it a thing where it really is our fault, quote unquote, and it's ultimately up to us to wake up and find the will within ourselves to fix the situation? Or, you know, there's a theory floating around, particularly in alt-right circles, it's called the Fleming theory, that, well, people are sheep and they're going to follow whoever's in charge, and oh, if we have the right people in charge, that will somehow turn things around. I mean, is it simply a matter of getting, you know, quote unquote, the right Republicans, the right leaders, or, I mean, do you really believe, as I do, it's incumbent on us to wake up, find the will to power to fix this crap?
The trouble with well, there's not a single true thing that the alt-right people say. I used to know some of their leaders. They're just troubled young men who sleep in their mother's
They're
basement.
ex-liberals who bring the right.
Yeah, and they're losers. They can't get girls, and so they take refuge in this ridiculous ideology. But the trouble with waiting for the man on the horse.
Right.
To come in and save them, a virtuous leader, is that makes you a slave. Just that very attitude. Ezra Pound, the insane American poet, who was really quite brilliant politically, said, anyone who waits for somebody else to set him free is a slave. Think about that. You can set yourself free in your own life. You can unplug. You can quit seeing the movie. You know, if you like movies, fine. There have been movies around since the teens. Since for 100 years. There's lots of great movies. You know, they've got what, the 5th remake of A Star Is Born with Lady Gaga. You know, there were 2 good movies. You don't have to see this stuff. You don't have to listen to their music. You can decide. Now, it is also true that we have had a very bad leadership in our culture going back to at least to the 1920s. A lot of this leftist weird stuff that you see subsidized by the National Endowment